hope that people who make their way in can find a place to squat, sit on the floor, stand, but make themselves as comfortable as possible. As preparation for this evening's discussion, we arranged to print out a simple map, and Pam Pelletreau is passing them along. The one thing I ask is that we didn't print out enough to give one to everyone. So if you can take one and then skip one, take one, skip one, I think it will work. But we'll see. In any case, our speaker will refer to them in such way that they're usable. This, as you know, is the sixth and final talk in the series that has been sponsored by the Ad Hoc Committee for Peace and Justice in the Middle East. I should make clear the appreciation the committee has to the Church of the Messiah, who's provided use of this hall and even would have allowed us to go across into the sanctuary had that seemed appropriate. But this meeting room in Fisher House has been the home of the previous 5 and now this final one tonight, and of course in years past. I should also express sincere thanks to the volunteer committee that has done the work of pulling these sessions together, setting up chairs, taking down chairs, a variety of meeting speakers, make sure they have what they need. And I want to express special appreciation to Mary Swope, who has coordinated the efforts of our committee and has been a backbone for all of us. Looking at the room tonight, I can say that there clearly is great interest in the topic. In fact, the room at almost every session has been filled to overflowing. What we've done, of course, is witness the panoply of events and challenges in the Middle East from day to day. And in a sense, we've had focused questions, discussions throughout the week after the talks. Some of you probably met other friends for coffee or walking down the street, and they pick up one of the issues that was raised. This evening's talk, Syria's agony and the widening Sunni-Shiite rift, almost jumps out of the first page of today's newspapers. It's right there. It's something that I'm sure is on the minds of any of us who take seriously what's going on in the world around us and seriously examine the potentials for discord and conflict and widening war. Our speaker, Professor Augustus Richard Norton, got off an airplane yesterday from his most recent trip to the Middle East. He spent his time primarily in Tunisia. But he's been on top of the issues for many, many years. He teaches in both the Department of International Relations and Anthropology at Boston University. He's also the director of the Institute for Iraqi Studies at BU. And I should indicate that he's also a fellow of the Oxford Center for Islamic Studies at the University of Oxford, on the other side of that body of water that sits just alongside us here. Prior to coming to Boston University in 1993, Richard Norton taught at the U.S. Military Academy, West Point, for a dozen years. When he left West Point to come to Boston University, he also retired as a colonel from the United States Army, ending a 27-year military career with combat tours in Vietnam and service in the Middle East. His recent books, publications are ones that many of us have learned from and can continue to learn from. Hezbollah, A Short History, published by Princeton University Press and brought up to date in press now for a new edition. Civil Society in the Middle East, of which he was an editor. Amal and Ashia of earlier. His recent articles, The Puzzle of Political Reform in the Middle East, Middle East Realignment, The Arab Upheaval, and most recently, Arab Revolts Upend Old Assumptions. It's a pleasure for me to introduce an old friend and colleague and a very informed individual, Richard Norton.
to thank Everett for a very kind introduction. I don't mean to date you by doing this, but when I first acquired an interest in the Middle East, the first book that I read, which really moved me and informed me in a way that shaped some of my own scholarship years ago, was Everett's book, Search for Peace in the Middle East, in the original edition with that very olive drab cover, if I remember correctly. But really one of the seminal accounts of the Arab-Israeli conflict, which unfortunately, as you know, is still very much unresolved and very much with us. Some of you may have come here today, on this lovely day when you could be playing golf or swimming or boating, in search of answers. And if that's the case, you might want to leave now. I really don't have answers. If I were in a position to have to advise a senior policymaker in the U.S. or elsewhere, there'd be a lot of head scratching going on. Some of you who've been in those positions I can certainly appreciate. I do want to help us to understand why the Syrian problem is so difficult to resolve. And I want to give you some sense of what I think is really quite unique complexity. I've spent a fair amount of my academic career in Lebanon. I think I've lived there for a couple of years or so. I've lived in villages in South Lebanon, been a peacekeeper there. And people know me, in some cases, from my work in Lebanon. So I want to begin by making the following comment, that the Lebanese Civil War, which lasted for 15 years, from 1975 until 1990, which took well in excess of 100,000 lives in a country at that time with a population of about 3 million people, was an easier civil war to end than the Syrian civil war is going to be. And let me explain why I think that's the case. Because I think it helps us to get some purchase on the difficulties that we're facing. In Lebanon, institutions survived the civil war. The army survived the civil war. The Ministry of Education continued to administer baccalaureate examinations every single year of the Civil War but one. There was a parliament that had some element of legitimacy. And in fact, it was the surviving members of the parliament that provided the institution for reaching agreement on the agreement that ended the Civil War. An agreement, by the way, that was understood in its basic principles in the first year of the Civil War, but which took 15 years to implement. Lebanon, like Syria, is a very complex country in terms of its sectarian or confessional makeup. In Lebanon, you have 18 different confessional groups. But in Lebanon, there's no majority. No single group comprises the majority. And the principle that ended the war in Lebanon, which is well understood by Lebanese, was no victor, no vanquished. Think about that. No victor, no vanquished. And what is the likelihood that we are going to see a situation in Syria soon where that same dictum, no victor, no vanquished, is accepted? What we're seeing right now is a battle which is an existential battle. For the belligerents, it's a battle for survival. And it's a battle which has already come with enormous cost. Over 100,000 dead, countless thousands in basements and prisons, and in many other cases living as refugees. During the height of the recent Iraqi civil war, which is to say 2006 and 2007, we calculated that 1 out of 7 Iraqis had been displaced, either internally or externally displaced as refugees. In Syria, a country of about 24, 25 million people, roughly 1 in 5 Syrians have been displaced. 2 million are living as refugees in horrible circumstances in many instances. We held a workshop at Boston University a few months ago and focused on the refugee crisis. And in some of these camps, for example, in Jordan, you have a problem with sexual predation. That many of the women, young girls, are subject to predatory sexual violence. In some cases, with people coming in from outside and basically using the camps as though it were a shopping mall for women. In fact, to drive that point home, one of our participants in the workshop, who knows the Jordanian situation well, pointed out that the #1 drug demanded by the camp residents was actually a drug, the classification of drugs for birth control, because women were deathly afraid of being impregnated by someone they did not want to be impregnated by. In Lebanon, you have a somewhat different situation, which is to say you have about 600,000 refugees. The Lebanese have not established any official refugee camps for various reasons, but these people have largely been absorbed into communities. You can imagine increasing tensions as people compete for economic resources and so on. Not to mention, I'll talk about this in a few moments, the violence from Syria sort of reaching Lebanon as well, as it has over the past month in particular. In Turkey, which is sort of the 3 or 4 star version of refugee facilities, refugees are doing much better thanks to the competent help of the Turkish government and so on, but still very much displaced, in many cases having a very hard time reaching sanctuary in Turkey. In the northeast of Syria, and you have a map, if you look at the northeast, is the region where you have a significant concentration of Kurds, who of course are Muslims, but comprise a separate ethnicity, speak their own Indo-European language, written in Arabic, but with Indo-European roots. You have a Kurdish population now, several hundreds of thousands, who moved into Iraq and are being treated pretty well by Iraqi Kurds, but suggesting that we may be seeing in that part of Syria some configuration of the borders of the country. The Kurds have had a quest, a century-long quest for an independent state. Whether or not they achieve that remains to be seen. But the idea that we're going to have a coalescence of a sort of enlarged autonomous Kurdish area in northern Syria is a very real one. Amongst the Syrians, we have significant minority communities of Armenians. They're about 2% of the population. Many of those who have the means to do so have fled. Some are now in Beirut. We have small communities of Ismailis and Shi'i Muslims, larger communities, of course, of Christians. About 7 or 8% of the population of Syria is Christian. Many of those Christians are true Maronites, many of them are Orthodox and so on. Those are people who have enjoyed a certain amount of protection from the regime historically, and in many instances are not particularly happy about seeing a group of Islamists or sort of jihadist revolutionaries taking over their country. In fact, many of those people remain loyal, maybe while holding their nose to the regime. We also have a Kurdish population in the country, about 3% of the total population. Of course, Druze population, about 3%, and look at your map, you'll see them down in the southeastern and southwestern portions of Syria, with brethren living in Israel, on the occupied Golan Heights, and of course, perhaps most notably in Lebanon. They've tried to sit out the war, the civil war, but they haven't always been successful. So each of these communities, in many cases, if you will, pursuing their own interests, finding their own sanctuary where they can do it with members of their own sect and so on. In some instances, supporting the regime, and in other cases, not doing so. In fact, even among the majority Sunni Muslim population of the country, we see a significant number of Sunnis, relatively well-to-do Sunnis, particularly in Damascus, supporting the regime. They've benefited from this regime, and they've done well economically. One of the characteristics of the regime that rules, or attempts to continue ruling, maybe we should say, in Damascus, is that it has changed the nature of the economic relationship between the government and the people. 15, 20 years ago, the Syrian government spent a lot of time and attention looking after the interests of people living on the periphery, peasants, farmers, and so on. And in fact, while you would never say that Syria was a particularly participatory political system, there was a lot of listening to the interest of the people who were working on the land with their hands and so on, living in small towns and villages, and in the secondary and tertiary cities of Syria. That began to change more than a decade ago, where we see the encouragement for Syrian entrepreneurs to return to the country from outside. They were given tax advantages and so on, and lots of state resources devoted to developing the urban economic centers. And while we think about the civil war today largely in sectarian terms, the fact is that one of the important explanations for what's going on is the people on the periphery, who are predominantly Sunni Muslim, not only, but predominantly Sunni Muslim, have really found themselves sort of sliced out of the economic bargain. These are people who don't have jobs, who live rather desolate lives, and so on, and have very poor prospects. Let me give you a small example of how things have changed if you're living on the margins of Syrian society. Thank you. I have a kind of medical thing that requires me to have lots of fuel to talk. Let's say you're living in a rural village 15 years ago in Syria, and you want to make a phone call. So what do? You go into the neighboring town, and you go to the office of the PTT, the Post, Telephone, and Telegraph Office, and you go inside, and you want to call your son who's working in Dubai or something, and you go inside, and you arrange to make a phone call. It's all kind of, 1930s, 1940s technology, but you win and make a phone call arrangement. You wait, and then after a few minutes, you're waiting in booth number 4, and the phone rings, and now you have a connection. And the rates are very low, right? With the shift in the political economy of the regime, landlines disappeared in Syria. You could go even into the ministry of telephones and telegraphs, and you wouldn't find a landline. Why? Because sort of predatory capitalists, not least the brother-in-law of the president, Rami Makhlouf, control the 2 major cellular companies. And the idea is they want everybody to have a cell phone. So what they did is they hired thugs, or laborers, they usually behave thuggishly, to go out to these rural and town telephone centers and tear out the phones. So you had to have a cell phone. It's true, literally true. So for people living on the margins in this society, increasingly they see, or they've been seeing a government which is not paying very much attention to them and to their needs. Now, it was a bit of a surprise, of course, but not too big a surprise, when the demonstrations began in early 2011. The Middle East is wired these days. In the old days, when a veteran diplomat like Bob Pelletreau was out there, you had state media, you didn't have much else. You'd probably carry a transistor radio and try to tune in to the BBC or the Voice of America or Radio Monte Carlo, some station that you could depend on for news. Nowadays, of course, we all know that's not the case, and I won't go on because we understand that very well. But people certainly understood what was going on in Syria. In the wider Arab world in early 2011, the uprisings in Tunisia and Egypt and so on, in Yemen and elsewhere, and were much inspired by it. There had been an earlier attempt to sort of enjoy a Damascus spring when Bashar al-Assad, the current president, replaced his father in 2000, but that was short-lived. As people began to organize and hold meetings and so on, the regime clamped down on it. But the demonstrations began in March. 2 months after, if I remember correctly, the president gave an interview with the Wall Street Journal, an extensive interview, in which he was bragging that we don't have any problems in Syria, because we've anticipated all these issues, and we're moving on a path of reform, and so on. And of course, the regime adopted the approach of repression very, very quickly when those demonstrations began, calculating that if they didn't crush the demonstrations, they would basically get out of hand. But of course, things had changed, and people felt they had very little, basically, to lose in many instances, and of course, the revolution gained momentum over time. It was a period in mid-2011, about the time President Obama was saying it's time for Bashar al-Assad to step aside, but it looks like the regime might not be able to weather the challenge. But of course, they have. And they have in part because of the intrusion of external forces, the support of Iran, which has been a generous supporter of the regime in Damascus. That's a relationship that actually predates the foundation of the so-called Islamic Republic of Iran. So they poured in resources, military expertise, and money. The regime reserves were estimated at the time of this period of protest at about $18 billion, and by some estimates they're down to as little as $2 billion at this stage. So the Iranian support has really been crucial. And then this spring, when it looked like the insurgents were gaining ground against the regime, of course, the Lebanese group, Hezbollah, intervened in April in the border town of Qusayr. And that intervention, that was a town that had been under rebel control for about a year, but that intervention was quite successful, and the sort of seasoned soldiers, the Hezbollahis, who had sort of cut their teeth fighting Israel in 2006, proved to be competent to the task, and they basically recaptured the city. From the standpoint of Hezbollah, looking at Syria, this is a vital supply line. They see this as a sort of existential issue, and they reacted accordingly. The impact of that intervention, however, has been momentous. The very well-known cleric, Yusuf al-Qaradawi, who for some years was based in Doha, in the Gulf, was a regular featured personality on Al Jazeera, Arabic service, has a wide audience in the Sunni Muslim world in particular. He had earlier been a supporter of the Lebanese group Hezbollah, but after the intervention in Al-Qusayr, declared in a widely noted speech that he'd been wrong, that he'd been duped, that in fact countries like Saudi Arabia and other countries that were very critical of Hezbollah were right all along, and he declared that it was the individual duty of Muslims to go to Syria to participate in the jihad, to battle the Shi'i Muslim militias, to battle the regime, and basically to ensure victory. And since then we've seen a surge of insurgents motivated by sort of incentive of jihad. When we think about the Syrian civil war, we tend to think in terms of big categories. The regime and their forces, a couple of army units like the 4th Division and the Republican Guard, about 50,000 men, at least on the books, and the so-called Free Syrian Army, and Islamist groups like Jabhat al-Nusra and Ahrar al-Sham and so on. But in fact, there is a proliferation of militias. By some estimates, 200 of them. And these militias, some sponsored by the government, many of them in opposition, basically are oftentimes local gangs, in often cases behaving very opportunistically, using the war as an occasion to gain resources through kidnapping, extortion, basically what we would call protection rackets in a kind of organized crime context. It reminds me in some ways of Lebanon, for example. In the 1980s, I used to live in a village in South Lebanon. I was a couple of hours from Beirut, and I used to have to go through 15 or 20 checkpoints, depending on the day of the week, to get to Beirut, each one run by a different group. You always want to make sure you said the right thing at the right checkpoint, and so wave the right flag. But imagine a patchwork quilt of militias, many of which are locally based, many of which have adopted, if you will, the sort of ideological banter of jihadism or whatever, but in many cases very much acting as sort of self-interested actors. So I talked about Lebanon earlier with surviving institutions. In Syria, we don't see institutions that are likely to survive the civil war, that are likely to have credibility, if you will, with all sides. And that's a real problem. How do we disarm the militias? Some of us might say, well, let's send in an international force. Now, I have some experience in that realm, and let me tell you something about international forces. In general, prime ministers and presidents and ministers of defense don't like to send their soldiers where they're likely to be killed. They want to go someplace where there's a sort of understanding. And in fact, in the UN Charter, there are two key chapters. One is Chapter 6 and the other is Chapter 7. Chapter 6 is about the peaceful resolution of conflicts. And Chapter 7 is understood to basically enable the use of force to impose peace, where countries are representing threats to international peace and security. People don't want to be deployed under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. They want to go with this an arrangement where both parties accept the presence of a peacekeeping force. And typically when violence rears its head, these forces tend to be ineffective. Sometimes they go home. There have been some incidents on the Golan Heights recently in the UN force there, the UN Disengagement and Observation Force, and some of the contingents have announced their withdrawing or have withdrawn, the Austrians, for example. So the idea of sending an international force is fine if you can tell me where they're going to come from, right? And who, you do have sort of Fijians who are kind of professional, competent professional peacekeepers and that kind of thing, but there aren't enough Fijians to solve the problem. By some estimates, going into a hostile environment to stabilize it, you need an armed force of about 100,000 people or more, right? And what's the mission when you get there? Who are the good guys? I think General Dempsey said the other day, in a reply to Congressman Engel on Capitol Hill, he said, it isn't a question of this side or the other. It's a question of sides. And in many respects, there's no clear side to support. So sending in the external forces, whether they're sent in by a group of European countries or the Americans and linked with allies, or in an international context, doesn't strike me as a very feasible solution. There have been attempts to reach a negotiated settlement. And indeed, the UN has had very able, two very able diplomats on the job. One, former Secretary General Kofi Annan, and more recently, a very respected Algerian diplomat, Lakhdar Brahimi, who at one point quit and then basically was persuaded to come back to the job. But very little prospect for a diplomatic solution. There is a presidential election scheduled in Syria in 2014. It's possible that could be a, if you will, a fig leaf for a transition, but there's no movement to that end at this stage. The President, I should say the Secretary of State, John Kerry, and his Russian counterpart announced a meeting in Geneva this summer, which would attempt to tackle the diplomatic challenge of ending the fighting in Syria, but that conference has never met. To the best of my knowledge, it's been postponed without any clear date for convening. Why hasn't it met? The Americans don't want the Iranians to attend, for example. The belligerents themselves, whether the regime or their opponents, don't want to show up when they're losing. They want to show up when they're winning. And you think about that logic, that encourages both sides basically to try and get the upper hand on the ground. And that really is not happening. And indeed, right now the country is really fragmented. If you have that map handy that we distributed, in the north, along the border of Syria and Turkey, you have a wide swath that's largely controlled by opposition forces, the Free Syrian Army in many instances, but in other instances, the Jabhat al-Nusra and other Islamist groups. This is an area that roughly corresponds with the Euphrates River Valley. And this is an area where the Syrian government conducts periodic bombings and so on, but has no significant control over much of the territory. I already mentioned the Northeast, where the Kurds have found sanctuary with their brethren in Iraq. Along the western border of Syria with Lebanon, you have a very complicated border. And there's a kind of checkerboard of areas in which some are controlled by pro-government forces, some are controlled by anti-government forces. I want to emphasize between Lebanon and Syria, there's a lot of exchange commercially and in terms of humanities, a lot of intermarriage. For example, Lebanon's country these days of 4 million people. Lebanese estimates are crude estimates, but it's the right order of magnitude. There are 200,000 marriages between Lebanese and Syrians. So you can imagine the sort of exchanges that go on across the border. There are border checkpoints, but those borders are very easily penetrated, all kinds of smugglers' routes and that kind of thing. In the northwestern part of the country, which is the heartland of the Alawi community, which makes up about 11 or 12% of the total population, and which is the dominant influence in the regime, you have the existing government controlling key towns, like Banias, Tartus, Latakia, and so on. And many people see this as an area that could, under some circumstances, particularly if the regime is pushed out of Damascus, could become a kind of rump state for the government. And indeed, a lot of the fighting on the ground involving Hezbollah has been involved in sort of protecting that corridor up through Qusayr, Hims, Hama, up into the sort of Alawi heartland. In the southern part of the country, along the Jordanian border, you have increasing swaths of land which are under control of the opposition, and there's a significant weapons flow to the opposition across the Jordanian border, which is denied by the Jordanian government, but is obvious for anyone who's been paying attention to what's going on. So we do see a sort of a logic to a certain amount of fragmentation in the country, which is going to be hard to reverse over time. What we know from other conflict situations is that when we look at areas which in the past have been heterogeneous, which is to say different groups living with each other, as these conflicts develop, of course, that heterogeneity is reduced, and these areas become much more homogeneous. And it's very difficult, even a generation later, to reverse those patterns. For example, taking an example from Lebanon, outside of Lebanon there's a mountainous area called the Shuf, which is an area where we have a significant concentration of Druze as well as Christians. Christians still own land there. They may go back and look at their land, but none of them go back. So a lot of these changes that are taking place on the ground are changes that are likely to be, if not permanent, enduring for some time to come. And then we mentioned those refugees. How do you get them back home? How do you convince them that there's a level of security to which they can return? And that's not particularly easy to do. If we're watching the news, and I'm sure we all were over the past few days, we're aware of the use of chemical gas, probably the gas sarin, the nerve gas, which has resulted in thousands of casualties and hundreds of deaths so far, according to what seems to be reliable international reports, particularly from Medicine Without Frontiers, the Medicine Sans Frontières, the French group. So what do we do about this? How can we affect the situation? How can we change the situation? How deeply should we be involved? Some of you will remember when Israel invaded Lebanon in 1982, the UN sent forces into Beirut in the summer of 1982 to help separate the combatants and to oversee the movement of the PLO out of Beirut and out of Lebanon, at least the armed elements of the PLO. And then a month later, there was a horrible massacre in the Sabra Shatila camps. And the White House reaction is, what do? Send back, right, Bob? It's exactly true. What do we do? Send back the multinational force. What's their mission? Well, just go there. And in fact, the Marine colonel who was sent there with his Marines, along with French and British and Italian components, his mission was establish a presence, maintain a presence. So what's the mission? That's not a very illuminating mission, and turned out to be disastrous. So what's the mission? If we're going to further engage, what do we hope to accomplish? What do we hope to happen after we take action? And that's a very hard question to answer. If I were to have the privilege of a few minutes in the Oval Office with the President or with his advisors, I think I would insist that we take a step that symbolizes our abhorrence of the use of gas, perhaps the use of offshore weapons like cruise missiles and that kind of thing. But I would certainly urge very strongly against any engagement on the ground. I think that's a big mistake. we don't have confidence. We don't have confidence, and we can't right now have confidence in our ability to arm and enhance the resources of militias that are going to respect our interest. That's a key constraint, it seems to me. There was an op-ed this morning in the New York Times. Some of you read it, I'm sure it was by Ed Lutwak, who's a kind of strategic thinker. I've known Ed for years. He and I have had some interesting arguments over the years, but I must say I largely agree with his major point in this piece, and that point was that we do not have the capacity to effectively change the situation. And unfortunately, the best option for the U.S. is, if you will, a continuing struggle in Syria. Because having one side or the other win would be worse. Because having one side or the other win would be worse. I think it was after the Gulf War began in 1980, Henry Kissinger was interviewed, I think it was in Business Week magazine, and his comment was, "This is one of those conflicts where you wish both sides could lose." And I don't want to trivialize the horrors and the suffering that people are experiencing. And my heart goes out to the refugees, and I think and I urge all of you to provide whatever support you can to sort of ease the suffering of the refugees. But unfortunately, I do not see, if you will, the leverage, the purchase that we can acquire by using a lot of U.S. military power in Syria, whether individually or in concert with our allies. And I think that's one of the things that really has very much cooled any ardor for engaging in the corridors that count. For example, in the Pentagon, where the people actually pay the price in terms of blood and sweat. So I'll leave it at that. I'm sure you have questions, and I'm sure you're unsatisfied with many of my comments. But in any case, it's what I have to say about the situation today, and I look forward to what you have to say. Thank you. Yes, sir.
How do we identify who's responsible for the chemicals? I mean, from what I've listened, I'm not totally convinced that it's the chemicals that are, release the chemicals. I mean, I would half suspect that it could have, it's hard to believe that somebody would release chemicals that kill so many children, but on the other hand, you've got so many crazy groups over there. And then how do we verify whether it's the regime or whether it's the rebels that release the chemicals?
Well, what I've heard in today's news report, and you may have heard it as well, is that a couple of UN inspectors are being allowed to visit the site. That's the start. I don't have any special secret information, but from reading what I've been able to get my hands on and talking to people and so on, my understanding is the regime has done a pretty good job of maintaining custody of the weapons. And reports indicate that they have been moving those stockpiles of binary weapons. These are basically chemical weapons that are not effective until you mix them together. They've been moving those stockpiles in order to keep them secure. And I haven't until now seen any report that looks credible about the opposition acquiring chemical weapons. We do have a report out of Damascus yesterday from the government claiming that they have discovered a stockpile of chemical weapons that have been under the control of the opposition, some covert someplace. But I've been around for a long time, and you might have been too, and I'm very familiar with situations where evidence is planted, and I think it smells like that to me. If you ask me to bet my money, I'm not sure I bet my house, but I think I make a substantial bet that the government's responsible.
Really?
Yes, sir.
Do you think that Iran is paying attention to the world's reaction to the chemical situation? Looking to see whether there is a reaction and therefore try to decide whether their nuclear program should go forward or it should hold?
Well, there are actually a couple of questions there. I do think that it's clear there has been a pretty fierce round of international criticism of what's happened. I think the Iranians would be very attentive to the fact that the Russians, who have been important supporters of the regime in Damascus, have supported action by the UN to determine what's happened, to investigate and so on. So I think that's certainly gotten their attention. The Iranians, of course, participated in that 8-year Gulf War with Iraq, in which poisonous gas was used by both sides. And in fact, there are a number of survivors of that war in Iran who can readily encounter in Iran, as I have, who still have the lingering symptoms of that exposure to gas and so on. And so on the one hand, you have a situation where the Iranians certainly have already sort of crossed the Rubicon in using the weapons, but are acutely aware of the consequences, I think. So I do think that would be, I think that, I think Iran is instructed by the reaction. Now, whether or not that's going to be something that has an impact on their nuclear program, I'm doubtful. My impression is, and I don't want to go too far off topic here, but my impression is that in Iran, there is strong public support. There are some dissenting voices, but in Iran, there is strong public support for what is described as a peaceful nuclear program and the right to enrich. So even if you encounter Iranians who are fierce critics of their government, you also often find those Iranians support the principle of the nuclear program. So I don't think you're going to find the Iranians backing off that very easily. The principle of the right to have the program. Yes, ma'am.
Could you speak to Turkey's involvement and what you see that you about as large?
Yes, and of course Turkey has loomed large. Turkish businessmen, and indeed Anatolian businessmen in many cases, I think, have driven Turkish foreign policy. You have a lot of Turkish business involvement in North Africa and Libya, for example, and certainly in Syria. And there was a very close and cordial relationship between the two countries until recently, of course. Turkey has been crucial in terms of providing support for the refugees. Istanbul has been an important center for opposition groups and that kind of thing. There's certainly been military equipment flowing across the border. I mentioned the Turkish refugee services, which have been far more competent than in other cases and so on. And on the other hand, the Turks have been reluctant to get engaged on the ground, even to the extent of having a kind of no-fly zone in the north. The furthest they've gone is they have reacted to shells being fired across the border, mortars and artillery being fired from the Syrian side, and they've usually responded by sort of rationing up just a bit to sort of send a lesson to the Syrians. And they have gone after some Syrian aircraft that have flown too close to the Turkish border, but they've been pretty careful about getting too involved on the ground. And of course there are internal questions as well. There's a question of Erdogan's relationship with the army, which he seems to have largely controlled, but on the other hand, if you sort of mobilize the army in Syria, are going to be able to control them and their game on the political side. And of course you also have a significant Sunni population in Syria. You also have an Alawi community in Syria, which is a significant minority, and they tend to be much more sympathetic to the regime in Damascus So I think the Syrians have been, the Turks have been somewhat more circumscribed than we might have expected at the beginning. And they remain so, I would say. Yes, sir.
The new government of Iran to exert enough pressure on Syria to stop them from using reserve gas?
I think Iranian encouragement and pressure, but particularly the sort of international program and the consequences of some military action, which I emphasize would probably be symbolic in terms of going out to some depots and that kind of thing, I think that is likely to check their future use of chemical weapons. And of course, it may well be that, this was an underground commander making a decision that he'll end up regretting vis-a-vis the regime. We don't know that right now. So, of course, that's the point, isn't it? To make sure this is a one-off event and isn't repeated. There have already been some small instances in which chemical weapons have been used. This is the first time on this scale involving thousands of casualties. Yes, sir.
With the situation with the gas, obviously, coming to the forefront of the use of it, what about Maliki's government and their ability to look a blind eye to arms and equipment that goes from Iran to their airspace to Syria?
Yeah, I didn't talk very much about Iran, and let me...
Could you repeat the question, please?
Yes. How about the Iraqi government in Baghdad, the government of Prime Minister Maliki, and their willingness to tolerate Iranian overflights, basically arms supplies and so on, using Iraqi airspace. This is, of course, something that the U.S. is very much focused on, trying to get the Iraqis to inspect aircraft and that sort of thing. Not very successfully. There have been some sort of symbolic inspections of airplanes, but they really haven't impeded that air bridge. Look at the map again. The eastern border of Syria is Iraq, and much of it is Al-Anbar province. And Al-Anbar province is almost exclusively Sunni Muslim. And just like those Lebanese families and Syrian families are intermarried, you've got all kinds of patterns of commerce and intermarriage across that border. You've got a flow of militiamen, of jihadists and so on, who are coming from Al-Anbar. And this is a seat of opposition to Maliki. So does Maliki want to take a step that will undermine the strength of the government in Damascus, increase the strength of the Sunni opposition in Syria, and thereby his homegrown opposition in the significant Sunni Muslim community? I submit no. Yes, sir.
What do you see the role of Saudi Arabia at present and in the future likely to be?
Let me make three comments about Saudi Arabia. One, they have been, along with Qatar, the most important supplier of weapons. That's crucial. And those weapons have largely been provided to the more sort of Islamist, jihadist elements in the opposition. There's been some adjustment of that under U.S. pressure recently, but that's one important aspect of the Saudi role, number one. Number two, the Arab language media is largely under the influence of Saudi Arabia. And that media, over the past several years, has had a drumbeat of sort of sectarian messaging against Shi'i Muslims, against Iran, and so on. So in terms of, if you will, public information, the regime in Arabia has had a very, in my view, sort of malignant influence on what people are hearing from electronic media, what they're reading in newspapers, and that kind of thing. And that has very much increased the, if you will, the levels of vehement sectarianism, particularly Sunni Shi'i sectarianism in the region. And I think in many ways it's unfortunate. Number three, the kingdom is in a battle for geopolitical influence with Iran. That's what's going on in Syria in significant measure. A late Lebanese intellectual, Hassan Twaini, wrote a book about the Lebanese Civil War, and he called it the War of the Others. And what he was referring to was the fact that, of course, Lebanese were killing each other, but in a significant way, what was happening is others, outsiders, were actually fighting that war, moving pieces around in the war, pursuing their own interests. We have the same phenomenon taking place in Syria. And in many ways, the Syrians, the victims, and I would say on all sides, are very much pawns in that game. And one of the big chess masters, if you will, and the biggest chess master, in my view, is Saudi Arabia. Yes, sir.
I'd like for you to speak to the theory that the regime is going to win the war. And the reason I say that is because they're willing to do whatever is necessary to stay in power. This is a guy that learned from one of the most brutal dictators, his father, to last 40 years. He's seen what has happened in Libya. He's seen what happened in Iraq when those dictators were overthrown. And in Tunisia when, even though he lived, he was thrown out. So he has the backing of Russia, who is doing everything they can all around the world to thwart the United States. He sees that one of the first actions that Obama took was to restore the ambassador to Syria. And I think he looks at that as a sign of weakness. And he sees what is going on in Egypt with regard to U.S. policy. So he has the backing, the financial help, and then Hezbollah, whom most people would assume was behind killing the Marines of Lebanon. They have rallies in Beirut. If we were really serious about going after them, we could just bomb the stage and get a lot of the characters there. So it seems like to me, he has all the cards and is willing to play them, whereas other countries like the U.S. is hesitant to even get involved. And in that kind of a scenario, it seems like he's ruthless enough to do whatever is necessary, because he knows there's nowhere for him to go.
Well, look, it's you or me. This is existential. You're right, the regime may win. But I think more likely is that we'll see this conflict, the civil war, which has now been going on into its third year, continuing for a long time to come. That's what I see. When I look at Lebanon as a prologue, I remember that 15-year civil war and how difficult it was, and I did argue, more fortuitous circumstances, how difficult it was to bring it to an end. So I see this as a lingering conflict. And why will it linger? Because the outside forces may not be willing to directly employ their own forces there, but they're very willing to use their cash and their other resources to make sure the war goes on. So I don't see an early end to this, unfortunately. I really don't. And your comments about the savagery of the regime and all of that are right, there's no question about it. And by the way, when they look at Egypt, the regime media has been applauding it. Great. You know, these Islamists are the problem. They're the enemy. This narrative is one that they find very much at home, that they're at home with. Yes, sir.
What do you think would happen if Assad was killed?
Yeah, what would happen if Bashar al-Assad were assassinated? I don't think there'd be a significant change in the behavior of the regime, and in fact it could be worse. There was an interesting comment made by the Russian Foreign Minister a few months ago. He said he doesn't think Bashar al-Assad could leave if he wanted to. In other words, they need him as a figurehead. But if you were to disagree as a figurehead, I don't think there'd be a significant change in the sort of correlation of forces in the regime. I really don't. And, the levers of power are controlled by extended family members. The brother of the president is basically the military commander and so on. So you have to have a much broader scale purging at the top to make a significant difference. There is some opposition within the Alawi community, and particularly segments of the Alawi community that have been economically marginalized. But it's not decisive. They don't have power. They don't really have the leverage to change things. Yes, sir.
One more question.
Yes, sir.
There is, of course, this Sunni Shiite thing going on, but can actually states like Saudi Arabia also be explained by the fact that they basically overseas Gaza?
Well, it says theocracy. That's Saudi Arabia isn't. Yes. So the point you're making is that this is basically a theocracy, and we can debate the exact term, but the basic point is this is a religious regime. And I would add, this is a religious regime which is rooted in the ideology that is particularly hostile to Shiism. So basically, the Shiites follow a variant of the Hanbali school of Islam, which is the most conservative, and they tend to be the most hostile to Shia Muslim, who they oftentimes describe not as Muslims, but as polytheists, basically as people who are not real Muslims.
My question was more about the fact that Assad, at least on the show I've seen, and I've been runs the secular show.
Oh, yeah.
The joke I was told in Damascus was that Assad for the first time to the mosque only after the Pope.
Oh, yeah, I'm sure that's, something like that is true. And, to make one point about this that's important, this has been a secular regime. It's been very hard until recently to really talk about sectarianism in Syria. People didn't do it. And in many cases, if you go to cities like Aleppo, poor Aleppo, what a beautiful gem of a city that was. If you were to go to Aleppo or Damascus, you would find people with long-time friends, and they didn't know the religion or the sectarian affiliation of the friend, because they didn't talk about that kind of thing. Right? So, yes, and this is one of the reasons that I mentioned the Christians have held their nose and basically continue to support the regime, because that kind of secularism is better than somebody trying to sort of push Islam down their throat, or perhaps chop off their head, right?
Participants who come to listen to this series of talks and has been as engaged as they have been. So thank you all. Thank you, John.